1983. Somewhere beneath the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, 400 feet below the ocean's surface, a Soviet Victor III-class nuclear submarine sliced through frigid water on a standard patrol. Its sonar operators monitored for cavitation trails, frequency spikes, anything that might suggest they weren't alone. But the screens showed nothing. Silence. Just the ambient hiss of the deep. And yet, they were being watched. Trailing less than 3,000 yards astern, nearly nose to propeller, was the USS Sturgeon, a Los Angeles-class fast-attack submarine. Its sonar array was passive, its crew hushed, the control room lit only by soft red lights and the slow, rhythmic ping of internal diagnostics. They weren't stalking to strike, they were recording. Every mechanical whine, every reactor vibration, every propeller blade signature was being captured, stored, indexed. The Americans didn't want a kill. They wanted a fingerprint. The Soviet crew had no idea. Hours passed. Then a day. Then another. The Victor-class sub eventually altered course, banking toward the Norwegian Sea. The Sturgeon mirrored perfectly, undetected. When the Soviets adjusted speed, the Americans adjusted frequency filters. When the Soviets dropped depth, the Americans compensated with hydrodynamic modeling. It was a ghost chase, one side fleeing an enemy it couldn't detect, the other documenting every detail. When the mission ended, the Sturgeon peeled away silently and slipped back toward the SOSUS perimeter. The Victor-class sub, still unaware it had been trailed, continued toward home port. Debriefing reports in Norfolk would later describe the encounter as total acoustic dominance. One sonar technician scribbled in his notebook, "They couldn't hear death breathing down their necks." Back in Murmansk, the patrol report declared the mission uneventful, but that was a lie. The Soviet Navy had just been penetrated at will, and the most advanced sub in its fleet hadn't even noticed. The true battlefield wasn't sonar returns or torpedo tubes. It was silence. Silence that spoke volumes. In the years to come, this pattern would repeat again and again. Soviet submarines built for power, speed, and range. American submarines built for silence, sensors, and surveillance. And every time, the outcome was the same. The U.S. wasn't chasing submarines. It was haunting them. In a secure operations room in Severomorsk, red-lit maps dotted with submarine markers filled the walls. Soviet admirals huddled over intelligence reports, calculations, and tracking data from across the Atlantic. The belief at the core of their discussions was simple, immovable. Soviet submarines were strong, fast, and above all, survivable. Their assumptions were drawn from numbers: how deep their boats could dive, how fast they could sprint, how long they could stay submerged. They believed that the oceans were simply too vast for consistent tracking, that a submarine moving at 30 knots, 300 meters down, beneath thermoclines and sonar-deflecting currents, could vanish into the abyss. But the abyss was no longer blind. What the Soviet Naval Command misunderstood fatally was that the Americans weren't fighting for superiority on the surface or with steel tonnage. They were fighting an acoustic war, and they were winning it with math, physics, and patience. Since the late 1952, U.S. naval intelligence had been quietly constructing an underwater listening wall, the Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS. Stretching thousands of miles across key ocean choke points, it wasn't glamorous. It didn't fire torpedoes or launch missiles. But it could do something far more dangerous, here. And once a submarine was heard, it could be followed, identified, classified, hunted. The Soviet Union, obsessed with reactive doctrine, missed this shift entirely. Their focus remained on brute metrics: reactor output, diving planes, acoustic tile thickness. Noise reduction was treated as a secondary concern, an engineering footnote. Soviet naval engineers were under crushing pressure to meet fleet quotas and keep pace with U.S. shipbuilding. The result? Submarines like the Victor and Charlie classes that boasted raw performance but roared like underwater freight trains. In one now declassified U.S. report from 1979, an analyst wrote, "If a Los Angeles-class sub can hear a Victor-class boat across 40 miles of ocean, the war is already over." But in Moscow, these warnings, when they were even intercepted, were dismissed. Western disinformation, they said. Paranoia, an attempt to demoralize Soviet crews and discredit engineering milestones. Instead of listening, Soviet command doubled down. More patrols, more subs, more speed. They were preparing to outfight the Americans. They didn't realize the Americans were already inside the wire, mapping their movements in real time, assigning acoustic fingerprints to every reactor class, and archiving entire patrol routes with eerie precision. The room wasn't filled with generals plotting dominance. It was filled with ghosts of a doctrine already obsolete. From the late 1960 seconds into the early 1980 seconds, Soviet naval doctrine hardened into a paradox. They believed submarines were their stealth spearhead, but they treated them like battleships. The Soviet Navy didn't just use submarines for deterrence. They viewed them as active warfighting instruments, platforms to engage U.S. carrier strike groups, launch long-range cruise missiles, and, in the event of nuclear war, unleash intercontinental ballistic payloads from the ocean's shadow. It was a strategy forged not from logic, but fear. Fear that the U.S. nuclear triad, land, air, and sea, could decapitate the Soviet command structure in a first strike. To counter this, the Soviets needed mobile, survivable, second strike forces. Submarines were perfect for that, in theory. But there was a problem. Soviet strategists still thought of oceans as vast, empty, unknowable. Their doctrine rested on four flawed beliefs. First, that Soviet boats could launch from the mid-Atlantic or Pacific undetected. Second, that the U.S. Navy would be too slow to respond once a launch order was given. Third, that American anti-submarine warfare, ASW, was reactive, not preemptive. And fourth, most dangerously, that underwater warfare was symmetrical. It wasn't. While Soviet engineers raced to field faster boats like the Alpha class capable of over 40 knots submerged, American designers quietly focused on acoustic profiling, hydrodynamic quieting, and sensor fusion. By the mid-1970 seconds, the average Soviet nuclear submarine was 15 to 20 decibels louder than its American counterpart. That made detection not only possible, it made it inevitable. But Soviet doctrine didn't adapt. Instead, Moscow doubled down on speed, deeper diving depths, and titanium construction. The reasoning? If they couldn't avoid being heard, maybe they could outrun a torpedo. They couldn't. The U.S. wasn't using its submarine fleet just to shadow. It was building a complete three-dimensional acoustic picture of the ocean. Sonobuoys dropped from patrol aircraft mapped transient layers. Satellite relays triangulated SOSUS pings, and submarines like the USS Baton Rouge ran quiet trail missions that clocked Soviet propeller cycles within a margin of 0.2 Hertz. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders continued to believe their doctrine was working until American subs began surfacing within torpedo range of Soviet fleets in exercises, sending an unmistakable message. We've been here all along. Doctrine didn't just fail. It shattered. Because the battlefield had changed, and Moscow never saw it coming. It began in silence, and ended with a revelation no one in the Soviet Navy could explain. In the summer of 1972, NATO's Atlantic Command issued a simple order: monitor all Soviet submarine activity moving westward from the Barents Sea. Tensions were rising over U.S. naval operations near Iceland, and Soviet Echo II-class guided missile subs had been reported in the North Atlantic. The USS Lipan, a Sturgeon-class fast-attack submarine, was deployed. Its mission: trail and track any Soviet submarine that emerged from the UK Gap, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom, and determine its patrol pattern without ever being detected. Within days, contact was made. An Echo 2 slipped beneath the sonar curtain off Norway, believing it had eluded NATO. But what it didn't realize was that every movement it made, every shaft rotation, every ballast adjustment was being recorded by U.S. hydrophones and relayed in real time to LaPon's sonar array. Over the course of 8 days, the American sub tailed the Soviet vessel across the entire North Atlantic, more than 3,000 nautical miles, without a single ping, flash, or acoustic alert on the Soviet side. The crew of the Echo 2 believed they were alone. They weren't. Inside the LaPon, sonar technicians whispered as they analyzed the narrowband spectrum. They could tell the class of sub, engine signature, even wear on the propeller blades. But they didn't just listen, they maneuvered. At times, they shifted position to avoid giving the Soviet sonar cone any return. At others, they rose or dropped hundreds of feet to stay within blind spots created by thermal layers. When the Soviet submarine turned toward Cuba, the U.S. sub surfaced, sent a burst transmission report, then dove back under to resume the trail. For 8 straight days, the Americans never broke contact, and the Soviets never knew they were being watched. Only after the mission did the full weight of the accomplishment hit U.S. naval intelligence. In debriefings, officers called it the perfect hunt. Acoustic data was archived, model signatures updated, and tracking software refined. When reports of the event eventually reached Soviet ears through espionage or defection, the reaction was disbelief. How could such a slow, passive, non-confrontational maneuver defeat one of their most capable strategic submarines? Soviet admirals called it a lie. Propaganda. Impossible. But sonar doesn't lie, and the ocean had betrayed them. The first reports arrived quietly buried in intelligence intercepts, satellite imagery, and whispered accounts from informants. An American submarine had shadowed a Soviet missile boat for over a week, never once detected, never once confronted. At first, Moscow dismissed it outright, but then came a second incident, and a third. By late 1973, senior Soviet naval commanders were facing a disturbing pattern. Their most advanced submarines were being tracked, documented, and trailed across the Atlantic and Pacific, and they had no idea how. The implications were staggering. In closed-door sessions inside the Ministry of Defense, admirals questioned their intelligence officers with clipped fury. Were the Americans violating sonar treaties? Had NATO developed a new underwater detection system? Was there a leak inside the submarine design bureaus? They refused to believe the Americans were simply better at underwater warfare. Instead, a parade of scapegoats emerged. Engineers were blamed for design flaws. Sonar officers were accused of negligence. In one internal memo, a vice admiral suggested that Western reports of acoustic dominance were CIA fabrications designed to induce self-doubt in the Soviet fleet. But doubt had already taken hold. Back in Severodvinsk, engineers were ordered to develop new propeller designs with reduced cavitation. In Leningrad, research institutes scrambled to create better anechoic tiles. Still, they couldn't close the gap, because the problem wasn't hardware, it was software, the human kind. Soviet doctrine had never truly grasped the nature of the silent war. They viewed submarines as weapons platforms, not intelligence-gathering instruments. American subs, on the other hand, were libraries of enemy sound. Each patrol collected hours of audio signatures, updated signal libraries, and refined acoustic tracking models to near-molecular levels. And when Soviet command learned that American subs could sometimes identify the exact vessel based on the harmonic signature of a single turbine blade, that's when panic began to fester. But to admit this in public or even to the Politburo was unthinkable. It would mean conceding that the entire premise of the Soviet Navy's second strike deterrent was vulnerable, so Moscow doubled down. They commissioned more submarines, faster submarines, titanium submarines. They pushed engineers to deliver revolutionary breakthroughs under impossible timelines. But none of it changed the core reality. The Americans didn't need to chase Soviet submarines. They were already there, watching, listening, recording, and waiting for Moscow to accept the truth, which, for years, it never did. Faced with mounting reports of undetected surveillance, Soviet naval intelligence began to formulate its own explanation, a theory that would prove disastrously wrong. They called it radio-acoustic deception. The concept was elegant in its paranoia. According to Soviet theorists, U.S. submarines must have developed a way to project false sound signatures. Acoustic decoys that confused sonar systems, masked their movements, and lured Soviet sensors away from real targets. Some believed these ghost signatures were being generated by underwater drones or dropped buoys, designed to emit the frequency patterns of Soviet subs and mimic their behavior. If true, it would mean the U.S. Navy wasn't just listening, it was lying to the ocean. The theory gained traction because it offered Soviet commanders a comforting lie. Their sensors weren't failing, they were being tricked. Their crews weren't incompetent, they were victims of next-generation American deception. It was a satisfying explanation, and it was completely wrong. American submarines weren't relying on deception. They were relying on silence, on ultra-quiet hull designs, sound-isolated machinery, and the most disciplined sonar operators in military history. While the Soviet Navy frantically tried to chase shadows, the U.S. Navy was refining actual performance, removing gears, decoupling generators, and building reactor loops so quiet they blended with background thermal noise. The result? Soviet sonar crews were listening for the wrong thing. They searched for distorted echoes and artificial pings, and heard nothing. Meanwhile, real American submarines maneuvered around their fleets undetected, collecting real-time intelligence and disappearing without a trace. Even worse, Soviet countermeasures began adapting to the wrong threat. Sonar officers were instructed to identify decoy patterns, to triangulate false positives, and to deploy counter-sonobuoys. Resources were diverted away from passive detection improvements and invested in what would later be described as phantom defenses. An internal Soviet Navy report from 1981, classified until the collapse of the USSR, stated bluntly, "We are preparing to defeat weapons that do not exist while ignoring the capabilities that already haunt us," and the haunting only intensified. As U.S. submarines integrated digital signal processors and adaptive sonar algorithms, their ability to disappear became absolute. They could trail Soviet vessels across entire oceans and then slip beneath their hulls without triggering a single alert, all while Soviet command clung to a fantasy that the Americans had invented a magic trick. But this wasn't illusion. It was simply evolution of a navy that had chosen to hear the ocean instead of conquer it. When the acoustic decoy hypothesis began to fray under scrutiny, Soviet intelligence shifted to another explanation, one even more misguided. This time, it wasn't about American deception. It was about space. The new theory held that U.S. submarines weren't simply using sonar, they were being guided in real time by satellite surveillance. Soviet analysts posited that American space assets were using infrared sensors to track minute thermal wakes of submerged submarines, or perhaps deploying ocean-penetrating radar systems that could image moving objects from orbit. To many in the Kremlin, this made sense. After all, the Americans had landed men on the moon. They had reconnaissance satellites like the KH-11 with optical capabilities thought impossible. So, why wouldn't they use space to peer into the ocean? What this theory lacked in evidence, it made up for in political momentum. Research institutes were ordered to investigate ocean surface perturbation models. Naval command staff were briefed on orbital surveillance evasion tactics. In one absurd instance, a Soviet submarine was ordered to alter its patrol depth every 12 hours, not for acoustic reasons, but to disrupt potential satellite observation paths. None of it worked, because the real threat was still underwater. The Americans weren't relying on satellites to hunt submarines. They were embedding acoustic sensors in the seabed, trailing enemy vessels with passive sonar arrays, and deploying airborne sonobuoys from P-3 Orion aircraft to refine their contacts. It wasn't space-based magic. It was methodical, brutal, acoustic intelligence. The Soviet Navy, meanwhile, burned resources chasing ghosts in the thermosphere, and the consequences were deadly. By 1985, Soviet submariners had begun complaining of phantom trails, patterns of behavior that suggested they were being followed, but without any active sonar pings or surface sightings. Officers filed reports detailing maneuvers that seemed anticipated by their unseen pursuers. Some even believed American boats were tapping into their communication wires, an impossibility, they thought, but it wasn't. Operations like Ivy Bells had already demonstrated that U.S. submarines could not only follow Soviet boats, they could literally tap into their underwater military telephone lines. The scale of information the U.S. Navy was harvesting was overwhelming, yet Moscow continued to misdiagnose the threat, believing in orbital surveillance and satellite-borne tracking systems, none of which were responsible for their submarines being shadowed like prey. Soviet naval strategy became a maze of evasion, misinformation, and superstition. Every unexplained anomaly was blamed on invisible satellites. Every missed contact was attributed to interference from above. But the truth was always beneath the waves, and it wasn't beaming down. It was listening up. By the early 1980 seconds, the Soviet Navy had committed a fatal error. They were collecting the wrong data and ignoring the right patterns. Inside the GRU's Naval Intelligence Directorate, analysts tried to construct predictive models of U.S. submarine activity based on fleet movement, weather patterns, even lunar phases, but their datasets lacked the one variable that truly mattered: sound. They had no idea what an American submarine sounded like anymore. Back in the 1960 seconds, Soviet hydroacoustic engineers had built vast libraries of American propeller signatures, but as U.S. designs evolved through precision-milled propellers, pump jet propulsion, and vibration-isolated machinery, those profiles became obsolete. The Soviets kept listening for outdated ghosts, and while they searched the ocean for yesterday's enemies, today's U.S. submarines slipped through unnoticed. The intelligence failure wasn't just technical, it was cultural. Soviet military structure punished error, discouraged initiative, and exalted secrecy. Junior officers who noticed anomalies in sonar data were often too afraid to report them, fearing accusations of incompetence. Sonar techs who believed they'd detected American subs but couldn't prove it were reprimanded for paranoia. Meanwhile, in U.S. attack submarines, junior sonar operators were encouraged to question, analyze, and challenge assumptions. The culture was collaborative, data-driven, and adversarial in the best sense. That asymmetry of thinking became the decisive advantage. During one infamous trail mission in 1984, the USS Dallas tailed a Soviet Delta III ballistic missile submarine from Kamchatka to the Sea of Okhotsk. At one point, Dallas positioned itself just 2,000 yards off the Soviet boat's starboard beam, close enough that her sonar team could hear the faint hum of fluorescent lights in the Delta's control room, and the Soviet crew never noticed. They transmitted secure messages, they ran reactor drills, they conducted launch simulations, all under the illusion of total stealth. But the Dallas heard everything. When the U.S. Navy compiled its post-mission brief, it included not just acoustic logs but inferred training schedules, crew watch rotations, and reactor status reports, all reconstructed from the passive sonar trail. It was total information dominance, and Moscow didn't even know it had occurred. Worse still, when GRU analysts finally caught wind of similar missions through leaks, Western press, or the occasional defecting officer, they dismissed them as psychological operations, propaganda designed to destabilize their command structure. But there was no illusion here, just a quiet war, waged with microphones instead of missiles. And by the time Soviet intelligence realized they were death in an acoustic battlefield, the Americans had mapped their entire underwater network right down to the sound a captain's chair made when it squeaked. The Soviets imagined American naval power as brute force carriers, destroyers, nuclear torpedoes. What they couldn't see, and never truly understood, was that the real advantage came from silence, from patience, from a system designed not just to hunt but to listen. At the heart of this system was SOSUS, the sound surveillance system, stretching across the ocean floor from the GIK Gap to the Pacific's deep channels. SOSUS was a web of hydrophones embedded in the seabed, constantly recording the acoustic tapestry of undersea life and war. Every screw rotation, every ballast pump, every sonar ping echoed through these lines and was logged, not in real time, but permanently. At Naval Facility Argentia and dozens of classified shore stations, American analysts sat in darkened rooms wearing headsets, listening to the ocean. They weren't sailors. Many weren't even military. They were oceanographers, physicists, engineers trained not in battle drills but in waveform analysis. They could identify a Soviet November-class submarine by the way its fourth turbine blade oscillated off-center under strain. They could hear a Delta-class change depth. They could tell a Typhoon from an Oscar by the slight harmonic shift in the reactor coolant pump. And they weren't alone. Aboard U.S. fast attack submarines like the Los Angeles class, this data became weaponized. Sonar teams received updated acoustic fingerprints, giving them the ability to track enemy submarines across thousands of nautical miles without ever revealing their position. But the system was more than sonar. It was doctrine. American submarine crews were trained differently. While Soviet sailors operated on strict procedural chains, U.S. crews were empowered to improvise, to analyze, to challenge assumptions in real time. A junior sonar tech could halt a maneuver if he detected something unusual. A captain could abort an intercept based on a single, unexpected frequency spike. Every acoustic contact was treated like a puzzle, not just a target. This flexibility proved decisive. In one legendary operation, still partially classified, a U.S. submarine tracked a Soviet nuclear missile sub beneath polar ice for 5 days, using nothing but variations in ambient thermal noise. The Soviets thought they were shielded by geography. They weren't. American systems weren't perfect, but they were adaptive. The moment a Soviet submarine revealed a new sound signature, it was recorded, catalogued, and uploaded across the fleet. Submariners referred to it as the library, a growing archive of acoustic truth. Even Soviet attempts at stealth backfired. When they installed anechoic tiles to absorb sonar, American analysts simply learned how the absence of sound revealed presence. When they altered propeller shapes, they introduced microcavitations, tiny bubbles that created new, trackable echoes. No innovation went unmeasured, and none went unanswered. While the Soviets chased phantoms, satellites, decoys, sabotage, the Americans pursued signal clarity. They didn't just want to know where the enemy was, they wanted to know who he was. And in time, they always did. Because the true American system wasn't just SOSUS, or sonar, or submarines. It was understanding of physics, of sound, of human nature. And it made every Soviet fleet deployment a high-stakes game, with only one side reading the rules. It was a naval exercise designed to showcase power. The Soviet Northern Fleet deployed a full squadron, 2 Echo II-class cruise missile submarines, 4 attack boats, and a surface escort group sweeping across the Barents Sea in 1986. The mission: simulate a blockade scenario, test electronic countermeasures, and demonstrate submarine coordination under simulated wartime conditions. They didn't know they were already being watched. Trailing the formation was the USS Augusta, a Los Angeles-class fast-attack submarine. Operating under complete radio silence, Augusta had detected the Soviet group days earlier via passive sonar, recognizing the distinct cadence of the lead Echo II's turbine whine. The U.S. Navy, had already catalogued that pattern 3 years prior. While the Soviets believed they were operating in stealth, Augusta's crew heard everything: depth changes, bearing shifts, even encrypted shortwave bursts sent to Moscow. What followed wasn't combat. It was surveillance elevated to an art form. Augusta maintained a deadly position beneath the thermal layer, drifting with minimal reactor output, using only natural water currents to adjust her trim. Every 90 minutes, she moved, not to pursue, just to reposition her listening arc. Then came the coup de grace. Without alerting Soviet radar, Augusta deployed a towed array sensor network, an advanced passive sonar string capable of triangulating multiple moving targets in 3 dimensions. The crew began logging precise acoustic data, not only where each sub was, but how each reacted under maneuver. The data collected over those 72 hours would later be used to model future combat simulations. It was described in a classified U.S. Naval Intelligence report as an underwater Rorschach moment, a total inversion of awareness, where the hunted knew nothing and the hunter saw all. The Soviet command structure had no clue. When the fleet returned to Severomorsk, crew reports described a flawless operation. Signal officers praised clean frequency windows. Sub-captains submitted glowing feedback on counter-detection protocols. Then the Americans leaked. A sanitized summary of the Augusta mission appeared in a NATO maritime intelligence briefing, confirming that the entire Soviet exercise had been monitored, tracked, and mapped. Moscow was stunned. The chief of the Soviet General Staff reportedly demanded an internal investigation. How could an American submarine penetrate a fleet screen with 5 sonar nets and 4 dedicated ASW assets? The answer was devastating. It never needed to. It had always been inside the blind spot. For the Soviet Navy, it wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was an existential humiliation. Years of investment in counter-submarine doctrine had been shattered by a single American boat drifting silently beneath them. In the aftermath, Soviet naval reformers pushed for rapid modernization of acoustic processing systems. A new generation of sensors was commissioned. Yet it was too late. The Americans already had what they needed. They had heard the future, and the future sounded like silence. By the late 1980s, Soviet Naval Command no longer trusted its own doctrine. The illusion of underwater invincibility, once the pride of the Soviet deterrent triad, had shattered. Time and again, American submarines had evaded detection, penetrated fleet formations, and harvested acoustic data with impunity. Every deployment felt compromised. Every silence echoed with paranoia. The strategic collapse wasn't immediate. It was corrosive. The USSR had invested billions in its submarine force. Delta-class boomers, Victor-class hunters, and the massive Typhoon class, a marvel of Cold War engineering, with 20 ballistic missiles and a crew of 160. But now, these platforms felt naked. The Americans, it seemed, knew where they were before they even left port. Soviet admirals tried to adapt. They introduced quiet running protocols, adjusted patrol lanes, and restricted sub-deployments to regions with high ambient noise. But no change was enough. The U.S. had embedded acoustic intelligence into every layer of its strategy. It wasn't just technology, it was tempo and ideology. Soviet doctrine was built on centralized command, rigid secrecy, and technological parity. But acoustic warfare shattered that model. It wasn't about who built the bigger fleet, it was about who listened better. American submariners weren't just soldiers, they were scientists in uniform. Each deployment was a data mission, every contact a learning opportunity. They evolved. They adapted. The Soviet system could only react. By 1990, the final reports from the Soviet Northern Fleet were grim. Submarine patrol zones had been cut in half. Fuel rations were limited. Training exercises had stopped. Crew morale had collapsed. One officer wrote, "We are operating blind in an ocean full of ears." Then came the final blow. The U.S. Navy publicly unveiled advancements in acoustic modeling and passive detection techniques that had been in use for years. They didn't have to prove dominance anymore. They just had to show it. And the Soviets finally understood they weren't just behind. They were irrelevant. What had once been a race between fleets had turned into a quiet, one-sided hunt, and by the time Moscow realized it, the Cold War's undersea battlefield had already been won, not by missiles, not by numbers, but by silence. Today, the Cold War's sonar duels are stored in black binders, declassified in part, forgotten in full. Few remember the names of the boats. Fewer still know the names of the sonar techs who won the war without firing a shot. But in the cold, dark waters of the Barents Sea and the North Atlantic, their legacy endures. The Soviet Union is gone. Its fleets rust in frozen harbors, its submarines mothballed or sold for scrap. But undersea warfare never stopped. It just evolved. Modern Russian submarines like the Yasin class are faster, quieter, deadlier. China is building its own fleet of nuclear subs, racing to close the same acoustic gap that doomed the Soviet Navy. And yet, the same challenge remains: sound. It cannot be bribed, jammed, or deceived. It obeys only physics. The U.S. Navy still maintains its advantage, not just through better subs, but through its culture of adaptation, its network of undersea sensors, and its doctrine of learning from every sound, every contact, every silence. Every new sub that enters the ocean becomes part of that ongoing game. One side hides, the other listens. And beneath the waves, the Cold War still breathes quietly. Somewhere in the depths, a sonar technician adjusts a dial, hears a faint echo, and smiles. The game continues. But for the Soviet command of the past, the lesson was final. They believed they were silent. But it was the Americans who had disappeared.